Hi, everybody. I'm registered dietitian Myrna Haag. Welcome to the Myrna Haag podcast, where hopefully I try to share some nutrition science-backed information that will significantly impact your life. So I was listening to a podcast earlier this week, and they were talking about protein, and the person interviewing the guy was agreeing, oh, yeah, sounds great, sounds great. And I'm listening to it, and there was no science to it, didn't really understand anything about the chemistry behind it. All I knew is that this professional person who I assumed I would trust knew what they were talking about because they threw up their letters up there, their PhD and everything else. So I'm thinking, wow, this guy must really know what he's talking about, because he's basically telling everybody a long list of things that they had to do. And I'm sure everybody's sitting there taking notes and, oh yeah, let me see, what did he say? Let me go back and listen. And I'm thinking, okay, seriously, half of what he said, I'd have a million questions on. Where did you get that? How did you come up with that? So what I want to do is talk about protein, because that was the big thing of the discussion. And I notice it's kind of trending lately. How much protein do we need? How much is good? Do we need more with aging? So I thought, I think it's good that I go over that with you guys. And the way I like to run my podcast is I like to first give you the science, right? Because it doesn't do any good if we're sitting here talking about studies or this or that if we don't really understand the pathology of what we're talking about. So I feel like it's always great to put everybody at the same level. And then we can go look at some of the research, because at least we'll have a better understanding at what we're looking at. And listen, let me tell you what, from a clinician standpoint, you can find research that says anything, period. Okay. So you cannot just go on the fact that somebody with initials behind their name, including moi, myself, gives you their claim. Okay. You got to be a little more tougher on them than that. Give me a little more information. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about, first of all, why all of this comes about. Honestly, quite honestly, it's usually goes back to obesity, because at some point they're going to talk about, yeah, but it's great for staying lean. And so I always find at the end of the talk, whoever's talking, it always comes down to how do we gain more muscle and how do we keep leaner? Even though we have an obesity epidemic in our country, everybody's asking the question. So my big thing to this whole obesity issue is that we're obese because we don't know how to eat, right? And there's these feedback loops that cause it. It's a biochemical feedback. It has nothing to do with your willpower, or you're just not tough enough to stay away from your favorite food. But the reason why I mention it is because part of the root cause of obesity, of course, not knowing how to eat, that you create these chemical imbalances, is muscles. Muscles have a lot to do with it, right? And so when we talk about muscles, everybody that's taken my course knows that when I talk about muscles, I'm talking about what are the things muscles want, because this is a big part of our health. And muscles want carbs and muscles want protein. So you betcha getting this right absolutely is linked to obesity. It's also linked to health and everything else. So bottom line, the muscles want protein and muscles want carbohydrates. And I talk about this all the time because it's a big part of knowing how to eat. So I give a rule of thumb, and we'll talk about that. But in most of the podcasts, you guys hear me say, hey, real quickly, guys, if you want to know a quick calculation, because I'm thinking you're listening to this podcast, you can't sit here and do the math. I can barely do the math in my head, but I certainly know what I weigh. And if I take that, I divide it by 2, I can get a really easy idea. So I always tell people when I'm on a podcast, because I'm sensitive to the fact they may be in their car driving, who knows what they're listening or how they're listening to me, so they don't have time to do the math. You take your body weight, you divide it by 2, easy rule of thumb. You get the amount of protein you need for the day. And then muscles want carbs. And I talk about that from obesity perspective, because I know low carb diets are the real craze. But in my other podcasts, I explain how that can actually make you fatter, not understanding how muscles want. So let's get into muscles, because after all, that's why we're here tonight. So let's talk about the chemistry behind muscles. It's really simple. Your body needs a certain amount of protein a day to maintain you. So muscles are going to be the biggest carrier of protein, right? Because you're covered in muscles. Everything's a muscle. Even your heart's a muscle. So muscles are predominantly the biggest hunk of flesh you got. So with muscles and most cells in the body, they want to maintain a certain amount of protein, sort of like a glass of water. Once the cell gets the amount of protein it needs, then it just gets rid of the excess, which means it goes to the liver, and the liver has the job to try to deaminate it. It's got to take out a lot of these compounds, and you get a lot of urea, you get a lot of byproduct in the process, which is somewhat acidic, right? So we can go into the whole science behind that. But for now, what I want you to know about protein is that the body needs a certain amount of protein, and that's it. And when you get over the top, the body just has to clean it up. Now, if you eat too much protein and you have too many calories, the body can use that protein once it does what it needs to do scientifically to it, and the extra calories from the protein, because protein will be chemically all skewed up in the liver, and then you're going to have these excess calories from this protein. And those calories, folks, yes, you guessed it, they're either going to be used for energy or your body's going to store it as fat. That's simple. So the body's got to take a protein and do what the body does in the liver, separate it out, can cause more urea, more uric acid in the body when you have all this excess protein, because it's kind of a job on the liver to have to do that. But the excess calories then can be stored in our good old fat cells, or we're going to use them as energy. By the way, muscles don't like to use protein for energy. So if a muscle, sees a calorie from a carbohydrate, fat, it's more likely to use that, but it can. So most likely that protein excess calories will probably go as fat storage, just like anything in excess in the body. But here's the downside. And this is what this video here is all about on the PowerPoint that I'm showing you. I show that for a 180-pound person, if you just took my easy calculation and divided by 2, would need 90 grams of protein for the day. That fills up that cell. Anything excess, boop, it's booted out. So here's what goes on. As you go through your day, you're doing your daily deal. Every minute of the day, the body's using protein to repair you. Every single minute of the day, because that's what protein is used for, to make more of you, to repair you. Every cell in your body needs protein. Enzymes, hair, skin, you name it. It's got a protein backbone. So as you go through your day, your body's using all these proteins to create you. And certainly as you go through your day, if you're not giving the body protein, it's going to have less available, right? So what happens over 6 hours, let's say you're at 90 grams, you go down to 75 grams, down to 12 hours, maybe you're down to 60 grams. After 16 hours, you're down to 55 grams. 16, 17, 18 hours, because maybe you're on one of these crazy intermittent fasting that, you just don't eat anything for the next 16 hours or 24 hours. Well, guess what, folks? After 24 hours, your body is going to have to get the protein from somewhere. And where does it get the protein? From you, your own muscle tissue. Your body will begin to metabolize your own muscle tissue so that it can feed the body to do what it's continually doing. Kind of weird, isn't it? The body eats you to make more of you. Well, that's exactly what happens when we don't eat enough protein. We actually go into an atrophy. We actually eat our own muscle tissue for the body's ability to keep the body going. So here's the deal. The body doesn't know you're going to eat one big meal at 5 o'clock. All it knows is it's 4 o'clock and it's been close to 23 hours. And trust me, it's already improvised. So the body begins to metabolize some of your tissue. Maybe it brings it back up to 75 grams. But at bottom line, and here's the big aha moment, because people say, well, how much protein do you really need for the day? How much can we really absorb for the day? Well, if the glass of water says 90 grams are full, and you just chomp down on your left arm and you brought it up to 80 grams, you're probably only going to need 20, maybe 30 grams from your diet to bring it back up to the top. So really, in a given time, your body can't absorb all 90 at one time. It's probably going to be at least half. Let's say for a person who 180-pound person, I might say probably the max they could absorb is maybe 40 grams. If you're a smaller person, maybe if you only weigh 120 pounds, you might only be able to absorb maybe 30 grams. But bottom line, I am so on that train ticket ride that people say not enough protein isn't good for you. You're right. We've got to make sure we get enough protein. And the key is that we want to do it not just once a day, because we don't want the body getting nervous and stealing from our healthy muscle tissue. God knows that's hard to gain, right? Because the only way you gain muscle is you got to work for it. And you got to work darn hard for it. So the last thing you want to be doing is eating away at it. So bottom line, we want to try to eat protein at least 2, maybe 3 times a day. That would be the best way. And of course, if we don't do that, we know that after maybe 16, maybe 24 hours, we can start to metabolize the muscle. So 2 to 3 times a day would be perfect to try to make sure that we keep the body calm. No, we got enough dietary protein coming your way. You don't have to chomp on what I spend hours at the gym trying to build, right? So that's huge. And also, we're not really talking about carbohydrates, but since we are talking about muscles, I am going to throw this in there for newcomers, and everybody's really tied into these low-carb diets. Your body, your muscles, they want carbs. And the biggest thing with carbs, if you don't give muscles what they want, they will send a signal to the brain that says, wants more carbs. This is one of the biggest things I talk about with helping people balance their diet in my course, the Myrna Method Lean Life course, is I really try to explain, look, guys, there really is just no one thing you got to look at. You just got to learn how to eat. And muscles, you got to learn what they want. And they want protein because they want to keep you alive, and they want carbohydrates because they want to keep you energetic while you are alive. So just like with protein, cells have a certain amount of grams of carbs. Like I said, we won't really dive into this tonight. I always love to just throw a little bit about diet because I feel like, hey, you want to know how much protein you need. I'm sure you're also trying to figure out, how do I really want to eat, right? It's all tied together. But bottom line, the biggest thing with carbs, just like protein, if you keep carbs too low, the body will actually crave more carbs. It sends a message to the brain. Carbohydrates also help store water in the muscle. That's why they're called carbofuel, hydrate water. So carbs bind with water when they get inside the muscles. And that carbohydrate goes in the form of glucose. It's stored glucose, which is glycogen, which binds with water. And why are low-carb diets so popular? Because when you get rid of the carbs, you get rid of the water. You can lose like 20 pounds of water in 2 months of dieting on a low-carb diet. You think it's a great thing, but actually it's just a lot of water loss. Oh, by the way, expect a binge, because here's what happens. Your muscles are going to demand carbs. Doesn't matter if you just ate a full meal. Doesn't matter. Calories don't matter to the brain when it's getting signals from the muscle saying, I need carbs. So for me, that's like really huge whenever I talk about muscles, and I know protein's going to be all tied into that because that's what they're telling us out there. They're really equating all this protein to health and muscles and obesity. So I just felt like I needed to throw that plug in there. Let's talk a little bit also about the biochemistry in general. So I refer to the insulin resistance type 2 diabetes science, which I know you guys are so tired of me talking about because it's all I talk about in my course, because insulin resistance is such a culprit, right? We know it's the leading dog in obesity. And insulin resistance comes from excess fatty acids, either from being too fat, right? Or eating too many dietary fats. Now I know there's a huge controversy on that. God knows I drill that one down because we are so trained to think fat doesn't make us fat. Well, nothing makes you fat than just overeating, whether it's a protein in excess, whether it's a fat or a carb. We're not talking it from that perspective. What we're saying is biochemically, when these carbs get into the system and you don't know how to balance because muscles want carbs, they can cause a real problem when there's too much fat in the diet and it's clogging up that insulin receptor site on the muscle cell. But here's where I'm coming through with the protein and why I mention it, is when insulin latches onto that receptor site on the muscle cell, its main job is to allow glucose to get inside that muscle. And that's a really good thing because we want glucose inside the muscle. But the other thing that takes place is when insulin latches onto that receptor site, it also sends a lot of signaling through the cell, not just to transport glucose inside the muscle cell, but it also helps with the uptake and with protein synthesis. It actually helps that muscle cell become more receptive to bringing in protein. Now, there's a lot of studies on aging because we have certain chemicals in the muscle that are receptive to this insulin, receptive to this protein, because it tells the muscle, it tells the body to grow, kind of what insulin does. Well, some of the controversy with too much protein with anti-aging says that it can click into more growth, more issues on damaging some damaging tissues that can be morphed in there. So we'll kind of go through that. I don't want to get too over the top because I want you to know just from what I just said here is that insulin plays a role in shuttling sugar into the muscle cell and also in helping protein be better synthesized in the cell. So that's a really good thing to know because I know with a lot of diets, they're like making insulin the villain, the bad guy, don't want a lot of insulin. And that's why they're doing these low carb diets, but super important. So that's pretty much the science on what's going on with protein, how the body metabolizes it. So bottom line, let's talk about what's out on the internet. So I just pulled up some research and I actually have them also on my drive and I can take you to the full studies as well. But I just wanted to kind of do smittens of it so you could kind of see because I'm imagining myself just like a person going on the internet, typing in how much protein do I need, looking at what I would consider reputable sources. So I'm not really going into any kind of medical journals. That's something like a health professional would know to do. I'm just saying the typical person going, hey, Mayo Clinic. Yeah, we all know about Mayo Clinic. They seem to know what they're doing. It seems like it's written by doctors. So why not look at the Mayo Clinic? So that's what I did here. So I just pulled up what we all consider pretty reputable. So let's see what the Mayo Clinic says. Are you getting too much protein? True or false? Big steak equals bigger muscles. False. That's what they're saying. Although adequate protein throughout the day is necessary, extra strength training is what leads to muscle growth, not extra protein intake. You can't build muscle without the exercise that goes with it. The body, this is from the Mayo Clinic, the body can't store protein, so once needs are met, any extra is used for energy or stored as fat. Excess calories from any source will be stored as fat in the body. Extra protein intake can also lead to elevated blood lipids, which would be cholesterols and heart disease, because many high protein foods you eat are high in total and saturated fat. Extra protein intake, which can also tax the kidney, poses an additional risk to people predisposed to kidney disease. So it goes on to say anywhere from 10% to 35% of your calories should come from protein. And you know what? We're going to be doing the math in here. So it's just interesting to see what they're saying, because once I show you the math, we can kind of come back. Because a lot of people, when they see the math, it gets all jubbly, juggly junk. And so you're trying to figure out, well, how does that relate to me? So they're saying the amount of protein you need is anywhere from 50 to 175 grams. And then they go on here to say that the average person needs 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight, which everybody hears now, eyes are rolling the back of their head. But I'm reading this because when we do the math, you're going to see it's straight from some of this jargon we're reading from the Mayo Clinic. But what they say here, for example, a person who weighs 165 pounds would need approximately 60 grams of protein a day. That's what they're saying. The big thing from this is what I want you to get is the body can't store protein. So once needs are met, this is from the Mayo Clinic, any extra is used for energy or stored as fat. Think of that glass of water I just showed you on the podcast. And when you fill up the glass, the water spills over. You just can't keep filling it up because it just doesn't hold more. And another key point, strength building builds muscle, not extra protein. Now, granted, if you're out there beating up the muscle, that's treated like an injured piece of meat. And yes, a little extra protein is needed there. But when we go through the math, you will see how those numbers show up. Let's get to the math. So protein, math calculations. Okay, everybody knows I love numbers because numbers don't lie. So even my whole diet program is based on numbers. We got to pull the numbers on our food. You got to know your food for their real value, not the little pretty picture that we see on the recipe page or the beautiful presentation from the restaurant. You got to be smarter than that. You got to see those numbers. And that's what I'm here to teach you. Food has numbers, and so does protein. So let's look at the numbers. The recommended daily allowance, which is basically the adequate amount, which many people consider to be the minimal amount. But when they did their studies, they found that this was the average amount of protein people needed to sustain a typical person. Now, there are some exceptions. You could be healing from an injury. You could be a bodybuilder. So they don't really look at the exceptions. They're just taking the average person. And what does the average person need? Well, here's the calculation. You take your body weight and you divide it by 2.2. That gets you a kilogram. And so a lot of things are done in kilograms. So we have to convert our body weight into kilogram. So body weight divided by 2.2, and then you multiply it by what the RDA, the adequate minimum amount, says, which is 0.8. So I use the example of a 150-pound person. If I took a 150-pound person, I divided it by 2.2 to get the kilogram, and I multiplied it by 0.8, I get 55 grams of protein. So a 150-pound person, according to the recommended daily allowance done by our good old government, says 55 grams of protein, which, based on a 1,700 calorie a day diet, which is a typical diet if they were maintaining their ideal body weight, is 13% a day. That's what they're saying we need minimum amount or even adequate from their perspective. Now, my quick calculations, because I'm just like, oh my gosh, I'm doing a podcast. Nobody has a pen and paper. I'm just going to give them a really easy calculation. Basically, when I said, hey guys, take what you weigh, divide it by 2. So that's 75 grams. So on the Myrna method, when I'm doing my quick calculations, 75 grams for the same person who weighs 150 pounds, and that's 18% of their daily calories. Now, let's talk about above adequate standard recommendations. By the way, those of you that are using my diet app, just so you know, I have used 1.2, which is at the high end of the above adequate standard recommendation, because God knows I'd rather be a little bit on the high side because the studies for excess protein are going to be anywhere from 25% or more. 35% or more in some studies. But I know this gives you 20% of your diet. And this, to me, from all the research I've looked at, is going to be safe on both ends, whether it's getting enough or worrying about some of the studies that show maybe too much isn't so great. So I use 1.2. So for the same 150-pound person, change it to kilograms, multiply 1.2, you get 82 grams. Now, remember, you can't eat it all at once, right? Because the body, if you wait and you eat all your protein in one meal, the body doesn't know that. So it could be chomp, 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 chomp in lunch because it doesn't know you're going to eat huge protein, half the chicken at dinner. It wouldn't matter anyways because all you could absorb is probably a chicken breast and a drumstick. But anyways, that's where I get my calculations when I put together the app. When you're on my web-based app for my diet program, I am using the 1.2 calculations. Now, injured, muscle repair, healing. This is what we're going to see in a hospital setting, maybe a burn patient. They're going to go anywhere from 1.4 to 1.6. Remember, we don't want to burden a sick body with excess protein because they got to clean it. And we don't want the extra uric acid. We don't want any other issues. We just want to make sure they get enough to do the healing. And by the way, bodybuilding means you have injured muscle. If you're really out there pumping the iron, and I'm not saying you go to the gym for an hour, I'm saying you're out there, you're doing 4 or 5 hours like some of these bodybuilders, yeah, then I could see why that you could need more. That would make sense because you're injuring a lot of muscle so you can build a lot of muscle. But even at these levels, you're looking at 25%. And the reason why I give you these is because I want you to be educated and have a resource so that when people are throwing things at you, like, well, I think you need 35% of your diet to be protein. That's going to be like saying 2.5 or higher, which I want to show you the science. There are a few outliers that are saying that, but it's not the standard, right? So I think we have to look at that and we have to ask questions like, how are you getting to that? So I consider myself to be a healthcare professional in the sense that I'm going to go out there and look at what's out there. I don't want to stick with some dogma and be stuck with it. That's why I don't advocate any diet. I advocate science and help you learn how to eat in the right science. So sure, show me the science, bro. I mean, you got it up there, show it to me because I got a lot of science over here. And that's kind of like how I look at it. And unfortunately, I don't get a lot of rich science. So I'm still going to stick with what I think is going to be the best science. That's how I look at it. The best science and where I'm getting a rich source of it. But caveat, that could change. Maybe next year they're going to bring me a whole slew of science and it's going to change my mind. But remember, we're getting science from all parts, anti-aging. So it's not just one bag of evidence. You got to look at all the evidence. And that's really what I think healthcare professionals should be doing. We should be looking at all the evidence, not stuck in a dogma. So I'm always worried when somebody's main job is to explain their wonderful, whatever it is, their wonderful supplement, their wonderful, and then everything they talk about, they will find research and find studies to support their wonderful, whatever it is. Okay. So what makes my diet program different is I went out, I looked at the science. Okay, yes, I did a lot of the brain work to try to give you tools to make it easier. But I'm like, gosh, the science keeps pointing to teaching people how to eat, not giving them a diet. No, yeah, I do that too, because so many people say, just tell me what to eat. I just want to see the recipes. Okay, it pains me. I just so you know every time because I'm like, oh my gosh, that's a diet. You're doing the diet thing. You got to learn nutrition and it's worth it. Of course it's worth it because if you can get your little rocket ship that you live in, your fleshy cage, If that thing is just going at 100 miles an hour, your world changes. Your entire world changes. So yeah, I kind of think it's worth it. I mean, we spend a lot of time looking at stuff that just doesn't get us the same outcome. I mean, I don't know. I look at what a lot of people watch and I'm thinking, really? This is super huge because this is what's going to make you fly through your world. And that's what you want to be doing. The idea is we want to be at our maximum. We have to have maximum health, maximum energy, because we want a maximum life. We want to fulfill our life. And you can't do it if you're sick and you're tired. And guess what? If you're obese, I hate to tell you this, and I know you may feel great, but you got more tiredness and sickness than you even know because you may not know any better. You may not know it could be so much better. Okay, let's go back. I got off on a ramble. Let's go back to the adverse effects associated with protein intake above the recommended dietary allowance for adults. They're basing it on that 0.8, okay? So they said, while high protein consumption above the current dietary allowance for adults, the RDA, 0.8 protein times a kilogram body weight, is increasing in popularity. There is a lack of data on its potential adverse effects. So they're saying, gosh, a lot of people are saying that that number is not really very good. And we don't really, there's just a lack of evidence coming forward to sort of go against what all these people are saying, high protein, high protein, high protein. By the way, I want to throw another caveat. I'll try not to ramble off, but it comes into my head. I feel it's super important. The reason why, why they advocate so much protein, I think, at least when I get down to the nitty gritty, is because protein does not release the insulin. Protein seems to be one of those things that you can eat, not get an insulin rush. And so from a person trying to diet, you don't have any backlash from eating protein. It actually can make you feel satisfied. It's got some good nutrition in it. So I get the whole idea why protein's easier when you're dieting to consume, because you're not going to get the insulin problem there. You're not going to have to worry about that. But okay, folks, why not just learn how to eat? Because you need insulin, right? So, if you're eating a high protein diet, you're probably not releasing a lot of insulin because protein doesn't really do that. So here is part of that science. If you eat protein with a carb, you're probably going to get the best effect, which, by the way, goes back to the balance I'm trying to teach you. Just saying. So anyways, this talks about the adverse effects associated with long-term high protein, high meat intake in humans were, number one, a disorder of bone and calcium homeostasis, which we will talk about that, disorder of renal function, increased cancer risk, disorders of liver function, which I talked about that. The liver's got to have the job of cleaning all that up, and progression of coronary artery disease. The conclusion, what they found, the findings of the present study suggest there is currently no reasonable scientific basis in the literature to recommend protein consumption above the current RDA for healthy adults due to its potential risks. Okay, I will say that we do know just from the science, and I do want to throw this in there, that guys, if you're going to cause a lot of damage and the body has to repair, then nobody's going to argue with the fact. I guarantee even the guy that wrote that is going to say, yep, we do need a little more protein to fix things that may be damaged. Not a whole lot of protein, not enough to cause adverse effects. And that's what I'm trying to get at. What is that magic number? Okay, is a registered dietitian, I'm saying 20 to 25% would be the highest. That would be that 1.2 that I recommend in my app, maybe 1.4. But any more than that, then some of the science shows there could be adverse effects, particularly with bone loss. And I did some great podcasts on my YouTube channel on bone loss. I would suggest you watch them because I think it really brings home the idea The bone loss isn't just about taking in calcium and vitamin D. There's actually a homeostasis that goes on between phosphates and some of these calciums in food. And this study talks about the average American diet, which is high in protein and low in fruits and vegetables, generates a large amount of acid, mainly as sulfates and phosphates. And that's where we can get off on this calcium imbalance, is that a lot of these high protein foods have high phosphates, not high calcium levels, but high phosphates. And this can actually produce a bone steal of calcium. I'm not going to get into it with this podcast because I already got into it with my bone loss podcast. But this does talk about a diet high in acid ash proteins cause excessive calcium loss. Alkaline buffers, which the alkaline buffers are really what I refer to some of these calcium properties, these calcium nutrients other foods have, particularly vegetables, this balance of phosphorus to calcium. It actually increases the calcium, especially when you have potassium and some of these other minerals that are in these fruits and vegetables. It actually buffers a lot of the balance that goes on when you're doing these excessive proteins. But bottom line, the point I'm trying to make here is that there's a balance here. Okay, folks, diet is about a balance, and so would protein be. Trying to find out what is the exact amount of protein you eat, what does the science say, does to some degree depend on this balance. So let's keep going because we got some other studies. So this study, and okay, I'm going back to the typical person going to the internet, School of Medicine and Public Health, University of Wisconsin-Madison. So you're thinking, okay, I guess if I was a typical person looking and I saw this, I would figure that seems like a reliable source. And that's typically what people do when they go to the internet. They just find these sources. They're not looking in medical journals. Now, I tend to look at medical journals, but I'm taking it as the average person just going through the internet, picking what may seem somewhat reputable sources. Okay, so this study talks about a diet limiting specific amino acids. Amino acids are the building blocks of all these proteins you're eating. So protein foods are made up of amino acids. This particular study says diet limiting specific amino acids may be a key to weight loss. Interesting. Researchers at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, in a study published today in the Journal of Physiology, found lowering the consumption of specific types of amino acids, the building blocks of protein, called branched-chain amino acids, improved metabolic health, even when overall calories were not reduced. So there's science that shows maybe an excess of all these amino acids may not be advantageous. So this professor of medicine at the University of Wisconsin basically talks about how the work indicates that reducing the intake of these specific building blocks of proteins improve the symptoms of metabolic syndrome, a group of conditions including high blood pressure, high blood sugar, abnormal cholesterol levels, excessive abdominal fat. They collectively increase the risk of diabetes and heart disease and strokes. We've identified a role of these dietary branched-chain amino acids, which are some of these amino acids that are in the proteins, that a diet with low levels of these amino acids promoted leanness and good control of blood sugar. And back down at the bottom of the study, it said, the study found that feeding obese, pre-diabetic mice a specialized diet low in amino acids, leucine, isoleucine, and valine, which are these branched-chain amino acids, promoted leanness. Now, guys, I bring this to you because there will also be a million studies that show supplementing with branched-chain amino acids increases muscle growth from reputable universities. So I think what I'm getting at is you will always find a study that's going to support whatever ideology you're trying to bring home. And I feel like I don't do you justice if I don't try to point out some of these, right? If I don't show you what's out there. And here's nutrition needs for older adults. And this is the National Resource Center on Nutrition and Aging. And they're saying, well, how much do you need? And they're going with that recommended daily allowance of the 0.8. So they're basically saying that's how much protein, and their references, because I always look, okay, where are your references from in making these statements? Institute of Medicine, Food and Nutrition Board, dietary reference intake for energy. They also talk about evidence-based recommendations for optimal dietary protein intake in older people, a position paper from the Journal of the American Medical Directors Association. So some of these are not just from, the other thing they get is from the Food Data Center, U.S. Department of Agriculture, our government, and what they're, okay, so I get it. A lot of research out there pointing us in different directions. So what I try to do is I try to think, what is it that we need to bring home with protein? I look at the biochemistry. I look at what proteins used. I look at the risk of too much protein. Where's that magic balance? I want to look at this other study. This is the National Institute of Health. This study talks about a high protein diet during Middle Ages was associated with higher mortality in a new study. In adults over 65, however, a high protein diet was linked to lower mortality. So what the research is showing is that when you are at the age of 65 and older, you might need a little more than the 0.8. And I'm going to totally agree with that. And the reason I say that is, come on, folks, as you get older, there is more healing. Okay, just because you're older, more inflammation, it would make sense. Maybe your absorption isn't well, your digestion doesn't work as well. It just makes sense that you would need a little more, probably a little more of everything, except for excess fat and calories. That's the one I'd limit. But anyways, calorie restriction, I love this, have to blow this one up. Calorie restriction increases longevity in many animals. It's known, however, if restriction works by lowering calorie intake or by reducing the intake of protein or other nutrients. Okay, so what they're saying here is that, and I always talk about this in my other podcasts, is calorie restriction, if you're trying to force it on your body, never works, because you're not going to be balanced. Your body's going to trigger an addiction of some kind. My whole course and what I teach people is that calorie restriction, because it is about increasing your longevity, the body does naturally when we know how to balance our diet. Part of balancing that diet is trying to figure out how much protein do we actually need. Well, I'm going to go a little bit into this study because they did more, talked about it. They talk in this particular study. Participants were categorized into 3 groups based on the percent of self-reported calorie intake that came from protein. So what they considered a high protein diet was 20% or more. Okay, so remember my math, what I showed you. When I'm doing your diet plan, I'm basing it on a 1.2, which is 20%. When I told you to take your body weight and just divide it by 2, that was 18%. I'm just trying to go back to the math we did originally. So you have a reference point when we're looking at this particular study. So they set it up into 3 groups. One was the high protein intake of 20%, which is you taking your body weight, dividing it by 2 is 18%. Using the 1.2 variable I use in my app is a 1.2, brings you 20%. They're considering that the high protein diet. Then the moderate group was the 10 to 19%. And that would have been the one that the government's, the 0.8 would have been the one that was a little more than adequate, but it would have been the 10 to 19 is what they consider the moderate. And then the low was less than 10%. And I don't ever advocate that for anybody. So they were further split into 2 age categories. They took the 50 to the 65, and then they took the 66 and older. And here's what they found. Adults in the 50 to 65 group who reported high protein intake, that is the ones that had the 20%, had a 75 increase in overall mortality and were four times more likely to die from cancer during the following 18 years than those in the low protein group. Interesting, right? That this study showed this. The moderate protein group were associated with a threefold increase in cancer. So here they're showing that taking a 20%, which we've already said helps with repair, in this particular study, this is what they're showing. Gets a little confusing. And then it says participants in the 65-year-old age group that consumed higher amounts of protein had a lower risk of dying of cancer. So this study shows if you were younger and you were eating a lot of protein, more risk of health problems. If you're older and you're eating that same increase in protein, less risk. But this is why it gets super confusing out there, because we have all these different studies telling us all this different stuff. I mean, I will tell you that I do see studies that talk about if you're older, you need a little more protein. If you're injured and you're healing, you need a little more protein. But I don't see things that advocate this excessive amount of protein that people are advising. I see on the internet to do 1 gram your body weight. Let's go back to that, because I'll come back to the intake of protein and longevity. But if we go back to the numbers here that I originally talked about, the math calculation for protein, is if you are doing 1 gram of protein for every pound you weigh. And if we take that 150-pound person, now that's not dividing it by 2.2. You're not changing it to kilograms. Some people are saying you need 1 gram for every pound you weigh. So that would mean instead of being at the 25% healing rate, which I put at 102 grams for a 150-pound person, you would be well over 35% of your diet from protein if you ate every pound you weighed 1 gram of protein, which I really can't find enough clinical evidence. Now, granted, you're not going to be deficient. We'll say that. You don't have to worry about not having enough protein to build and repair. That's not the issue. The issue is the adverse effects. So I would say that's definitely excessive. And I see that on the internet with people with PhDs after their name. Okay, maybe you have science, but bring it to the table. Don't just do a podcast talking to somebody about and then everybody's taking notes because you said it. Tell me the science behind that. Let me see. Because are you looking at the adverse effects? The biggest thing I see, folks, is so many times they just look at one little square, one little positive thing in that square, and they don't blow up everything and say, wait a minute, folks. We got to look at everything. Yes, protein builds and repairs. Absolutely. If you don't get enough protein, it's a problem. But folks, if they're telling you to have 1 gram of protein for every pound you weigh, and they don't even tell you that you got to eat it 2 or 3 times a day, that's a problem right there, right? So it's not just about the amount, although I can't find enough evidence to support that amount as being the end all. I find that there could be some adverse effects. So this study talks about the impact of dietary protein intake on longevity and metabolic health, another study. Lifespan and metabolic health are influenced by dietary nutrients. Yep, we know that. Recent studies show that a reduced protein intake or a low protein / high carbohydrate diet plays a critical role in longevity and metabolic health. Additionally, specific amino acids, including methionine and branched chain amino acids, I think we've heard that in the other studies, right, are associated with the regulation of lifespan, aging, and metabolism through multiple mechanisms. Therefore, methionine or branched-chain amino acid restriction may lead to the benefits on longevity and metabolic health. So here's another one promoting that with age, too many of these proteins could click into more of these, and I don't want to get too deep into the science, but methionine is one of those amino acids. It helps with growth. Same with branched chain amino acids. That's why bodybuilders love them. But then they also say you have to be concerned with aging because maybe growth isn't always necessarily positive in some ways. And I think this study, and this is just research, this was just something I pulled from the internet. This is not a medical journal, but they bring some light to this, and I really have to give you the science on it, but I'm being an average person searching, and they talk about the wave of research revealed that weight loss came at a cost. High protein diets were linked with higher rates of heart disease and also with shorter lifespans. Now, for the first time, researchers understand why a high protein diet can reduce both our lifespan and our health span. And they basically talk in this that these proteins at the bottom, when cells have more of these amino acids, they make protein faster. But when cells have more of these amino acids, they also can make more mistakes, according to this professor. And this can lead to polymorphisms, little oopses in the cells that shouldn't have happened. And with anti-aging, part of that is to reduce these likelihoods, these mistakes in the cells they can populate. In aging, we're trying to reduce that. And the more you age, the more probability you have for mistakes in the cells. I won't get into the chemistry of all that because we would need a whole nother hour to talk about that. But bottom line, where do I sit on protein? The science on protein is, number one, the takeaway. Definitely we need a certain amount. Over the amount, it's just a spillover. How much do we need? Reasonable, according to all the studies. We do the math, numbers don't lie. Safely, I would say, if you're in the range of 18 to 20%. Now, we saw some studies that, oh yeah, well, too high, we got to be careful. Okay, so I think 18 to 20% will cover us because it's not going to be too high to worry about some of these dietary ill effects that happen with excess protein. It could cover us for maybe some injury repair. But even if you're not at 20% and you're at 15%, or you're down around 75 grams, 18%, you're probably still going to be okay. This is the numbers. Numbers don't lie. I'm watching the research, guys, and if I see enough research that I feel is really convincing enough, I'm coming aboard. I'm gonna say, oh yeah, you know that podcast I did? Well, here's the new research. But there's just too much research on the other side for me to support all this excess protein really doing more benefit than maybe possibly more harm. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to knowing how to eat a balanced diet. Okay, it's 5 minutes till the hour. I wanted to leave it open for questions. I want to be respectful in my podcast to try to keep them in an hour, and I'm trying to get better, maybe even keep them less time because I know you guys have better things to do. Although I do think this is a really good thing to do, but I know that there's other things in your life that are probably more fun. But anyways, I'm going to leave it open. If anybody wants to ask questions, I'll check the chat. You can also, I'm totally cool with you unmuting your mic. Awesome.
Yeah, I have a question about what happens. So you mentioned that excess protein in the body goes to the liver. What are the effects of excess protein on the liver, especially if over time the liver has to work hard every day from consuming all this protein?
So that's a really good question. So the liver doesn't just get compromised from I had 1 or 2 years of protein overuse. So it really depends a lot on on the person, right? So a lot of people can be compromised in other areas. They can have autoimmune disorders, they can be taking medications because the liver basically has got to clean everything. And then the kidneys have got to get rid of it. So those are like the two filtering units in your body. So it just taxes the liver and it can cause a lot of issues so if you have certain health problems, it can make those compound them and make them worse. So the liver's like any organ. If you're overdoing it, you're going to create a situation where it works harder. You can also produce more urea, more uric acid in the system, and this has other effects, right? So people can get gout, they can get it's actually inflammatory, can cause more inflammation. So all this excess that the body's not really designed to handle, I mean, it will handle over short periods. So I don't want um people to think it just this is over a longer periods of this type of abuse. It just puts a lot of strain on the body. So I know that when I'm working with people and they have a lot of purines in their blood, they've got a lot of these metabolic breakdown from all this protein. This causes other health issues, right? So they have more inflammation. So the byproducts can lead to more health issues that can make you more unhealthy. I mean, cause more other associated complications. Did that help?
Yes, thank you.
Hey, Myrna, when you're working with patients that are over the age of 65, I notice a lot that I really struggle to help them eat at an zero point 0.8 ratio. And I don't know how do you overcome that low appetite, even if they're not at that age range, with trying to increase the protein intake.
Yeah, I find that really tough for people over 80, right? Um, I use protein powders. I mean, because I have the same issue. I do they're big on soups. I don't know why, but they do love soups. So I'm always suggesting a bone broth because at least I know it's lower in fat. It's got 9 grams of protein per cup. So I try to get them to sneak in the protein in foods that they're already eating. So I'm just doing the protein sneak, so I'm coming up with things that are we're just supplementing. Now, a lot of times they're not going to weigh a lot, right? So we're not looking at a 150-pound person. You might be looking at 100 well, maybe for a male, 150, but they're usually lighter in weight. So, you might be at 70 grams of protein. To me, I'm sneaking it in. I'm trying to do um protein powders. I don't know if that helps, but
Bone broth was new. That's helpful. Thank you.
yeah, bone broth. I'm always sometimes I'll do bone broth and then I'll have them put a little collagen in it because they can't taste collagen protein. And so I'm giving them something that's got like 20 grams of protein and they don't know it. So they're not eating a lot of volume, but I'm getting that protein in there. I'm sneaking it in. That's a good question, though. I've got a question in the chat. Oh, awesome. Thank you. Great discussion. I learned a lot. Thank you. That means a lot because my goal is to give you guys really good information that you can use, right? And not confuse you, hopefully. Anyways, any other questions? Just feel free to unmute your mic or drop it in the chat. Okay. If I have no other questions, Tuesday night, that's the night where we dive into lean life. That's where I'm just going to talk about how to live your leanest based on those videos. I encourage you to watch it. To me, it's the holy grail until I'm told otherwise. It works every time. If you need help, we're here to help you. Food coach Karen is on Mondays in the evening, and on Thursdays, you can always get with her to help you with your app. So please, 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 let's do it. Let's be our healthiest and our leanest. Until next time, I will see you guys later. Thank you.